We have Michael Yaki.
Thank you.
You're welcome. ladies and gentlemen, we are 1 minute until top of the hour.
Jonathan, we may be just a little slight delay. The chair is just walking in, okay?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. You can go ahead and join the groups and we'll just hold on, okay? So they'll be ready to go.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Joining Ms. Timmons-Goodson.
So we're ready to start. Are you got everybody on?
We have Jennifer Steinfeld, Patricia Timmons-Goodson.
The listening groups, have you combined them? Okay, great. So we're ready to start. You can go ahead and start your script.
Okay, 1 moment, please. Good day, and welcome to the Commission Business Meeting. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Chair Catherine Lehman. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This meeting of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights comes to order at 10:01 a.m. on December 7th, 2018. The meeting takes place at the Commission's headquarters located at 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. I'm Chair Catherine Lehman, and the commissioners who were present at this meeting in addition to me are Commissioner Degbelet, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Kirsnow, and Commissioner Chladni. On the phone, please confirm that you are on the line after I say your name. I believe we have Commissioner Yaki.
Here.
And Vice Chair Timmons-Goodson.
Yes.
Thank you. I understand Commissioner Narasaki will be joining us later, and she'll let us know when she's on the line. The quorum of the commissioners is present. Is the court reporter present? Thank you. Is the staff director present?
Present.
Thank you. The meeting now comes to order. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for this business meeting?
I move to approve the agenda.
Thank you.
This is Vice Chair Timmons-Goodson, so moved.
Thank you. I'm going to treat that as a motion and a second. I'll begin the call for amendments with several of my own. First, I move to amend to take off the presentation from our Connecticut State Advisory Committee Chair, who unfortunately could not make it for today's meeting. We hope to hear from him in January. Second, I move to amend for consideration of a statement I propose on the Commission's legislative and oversight priorities for the new Congress. And third, I move to amend for consideration of several statements that Commissioner Narasaki will introduce, though she could not be here with us at the outset of the meeting. Those items are for consideration of a letter to HHS regarding the definition of sex, a letter to DHS for public comment submission on the public charge proposed rule, and third is a statement on citizenship. Is there a second for my amendments?
I so move. A second.
Thank you. Any other amendments?
I have an amendment.
Commissioner Yaki, go ahead.
Yes, I'd just like to add to the agenda an item to change the dates for the statements due on the Stand Your Ground report.
Terrific. Is there a second?
Chladni, I'll second.
Thank you. Are there any other amendments? There's no further amendments. Let's vote to approve the agenda as amended. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes unanimously. We'll now hear over the phone from our Rhode Island Advisory Committee Chair, Jennifer Steinfeld, on the committee's recently released report titled Payday Lending in Rhode Island. Chair Steinfeld, we'll look forward to hearing from you for 10 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us speak today and for all of the support that you've given to this effort. I'm really pleased to be able to give you an overview of how we arrived at our report. But first, I want to thank Barbara Delavaze and Evelyn Bohor and an intern over the summer, Nicole Carroll, who were incredibly instrumental in preparing this report, and then our committee come together. We were reappointed just over a year ago and have been lucky to be very active since that time. We quickly realized in our reconstitution that we had an opportunity to have a substantial local impact on an important public policy issue around payday lending. There was legislation that had been here, annual consent legislation is reintroduced annually in January, and there had been no motion, but there was a piece of pending legislation in the spring of this year that had some energy behind it and needed an extra boost. So we were able to convene a hearing on April 27th, 2018, where we brought together members of the public. That was our first in-person meeting since our reconvening. We had invited representation from a wide variety of stakeholders for several panels speaking about the issue of payday lending in the state of Rhode Island. And I'm sure you've all read the report, but we invited representations from the payday lending industry, their lobbyists, as well as some legislators who had been opposing the legislation without any response, which Barbara Delavie has told me is very unusual for her as a federal official to have no response to her calls. We had unanimous information that not only articulated the harm of payday lending, which I think we were all clear about, but also really articulated clearly the explicit targeting of both low-income people and people of color. And most compelling to me was a map that was brought to us by a local advocacy organization, the Economic Progress Institute, that showed an overlay of maps of the census tracts with the highest proportion of the African American community in our state that overlapped consistently with the map of the highest concentration of payday lenders in the state. This is clearly a significant effort on behalf of the lending industry to really look at low-income people, looking at particularly low-income people of color. Another interesting finding is that one of the arguments that's often made against payday lending is that it serves an important service for people who don't have access to traditional banking. But another finding that we had was that, in fact, to receive a payday loan, you must have a bank account and a job in order to get a payday loan. So that's actually not true. It's not something that's serving an unbanked industry. We also found that there are several local alternatives, including a local credit union that provides emergency loans and a local CDFI, a community development finance institution that offers lower interest loan alternatives. We were able to pull together a summary of our findings to do advocacy in support of that legislation in the spring. And two of our members met with the Speaker of the House, who's been a consistent opponent of the limitation. So essentially, payday lenders have a carve-out from the state usury laws. And so there's been legislation to try to put them back into the state usury statute, which limits the interest rate, I think, at 28%. And our members found not only did they expected to have a very short, cordial meeting where they were sort of given the brush off, but they actually had an incredibly hostile 20-minute conversation where the Speaker of the House rejected any findings that there was a civil rights violation or that these loans create a debt trap, despite ample evidence to the contrary. So we had to move tactics. He was up for re-election this fall. He was re-elected in a very close race and was just re-elected as Speaker of the House. So it's unclear what the future of legislation will be this year. But two of our members on our advisory committee are also part of an advocacy effort on this issue, and we'll be meeting next week, so they'll be updating us on what we can do for the 2019 legislative session. Technically, our work on this issue concluded with the issuance of our report, but we just had a letter from Chair Lahman and go out to legislators and just outlining the recommendations that we made around payday loan alternatives, recommending legislative action, to restrict the maximum interest rate to 36% APR. And this is a recommendation to get the payday lenders back into alignment with the state usury laws. So stay tuned for additional advocacy on this important issue that's certainly impacting our community quite significantly. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Chair Steinfeld. I'll open for questions from my fellow commissioners. I see Commissioner Cladney has a question.
I just like to make a statement. I thought the report was well done. We had proposed at one time in my office to do a briefing here on payday lending, and we subsequently didn't do it. But what our research found, and I don't think Rhode Island has very many military bases, but where there are military bases, these payday lending stores line the entranceway to the main gate because a lot of soldiers and sailors use those services. And as a result, if they miss a payment, the payday lending place can just get a hold of their commanding officer and they withhold from their pay. And it's really been quite a detriment to military members. I just wanted to make that statement, but I thought your report was excellently done. Thank you.
Thank you. We actually did reach out. We have a naval base, and the Naval War College is located here in Rhode Island. We did reach out to the military, and the statement that they gave us is that there actually is a federal regulation that is now no longer allowing payday lenders to, they consider it to be a troop insecurity issue to loan to active duty military. So it's quite a significant issue for the military, and they've taken action as well, which I think strengthens the power of our report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, I guess I have some questions.
Commissioner Harriet?
Thank you for that presentation. I was just working out what 26% would be on a $200
I'm sorry, it's actually
loan.
35%. So 36%.
It's written here as 36, but I don't think it's going to make any difference to my point. And, you know, that's less than $3 on a 2-week loan, which is probably too little to make processing worth it. One response that a payday lender could have to that would be to decline to make tiny loans and make larger ones where the interest rate might pay at least the processing costs. And they might demand of people who are desperate for the money that they borrow more than they would ordinarily need. Is this something that you gave some thought to?
The information that we have is that actually the business model does not make a profit on the initial loan. It requires, the business model actually requires this debt trap to be viable. So it requires people to take multiple loans out and pay an initiation fee as well as the interest rate over a period of time. And the model requires that around 4 loans. Most people we found were taking around 6 to 8 loans in order to be able to pay it back. It's very unlikely if in one pay period you don't have, let's say $500 to fix your car, that you have an extra $500 in the next pay period, that you have earnings in excess of that loan amount. And so really this model is about keeping people in multiple loans, which is in violation, well, not technically in violation, but in violation of the spirit of the state usury laws as well.
Yeah, but
so there
that
are
just makes my
emergency
point
loans.
all the more telling. If that's the business model, then the loan's going to be larger now. And so keeping the interest rate down will actually make things worse rather than make them better.
Well, I think our hope is that there will be an increase in alternative lending sources, including, as I said, there's a local credit union and a local CDFI that offer
Again, they're going to
emergency
want the
loans, and those
larger
are-
loans. They're going to want the larger loans, which is going to make
No.
it
They're
worse rather
limited
than better.
to. They're limited
these things
to.
exist
Commissioner
because
Harris.
Madam Chair, can
there's
people go one at a
a
time?
market for them.
Commissioner Harriet, we should let the chair of the SAC speak and at least allow for a transcript.
Yeah, I apologize. Those emergency loans are actually limited in one case to $500 and in another case to $750. They are quite small and they are not designed. They're a break-even product for the lenders. These are services that are being offered to the community. One of the lenders is a credit union, and they're offering it to their members because they were noticing that a number of their members were having their bank accounts closed due to overdraw, and the overdraw is being done by the payday lenders. And so they started offering this product to their members because they spoke to their members who actually don't want to see their bank accounts shut down, but were in a short-term capital need. And the local CDFI is, mission oriented towards reducing poverty by reducing debt traps. And so they too offer an emergency loan product. I should say I'm on the board of that organization. I'm the treasurer of the board of that organization. And that's a money loser for the CDFI, but is offered as a mission oriented product. The loan origination does cost more money than the loan generates.
What organization are you on the board of?
The Capital Good Fund, which is a community development finance organization.
And is that a paid position?
No.
Is anybody on the SAC in a paid position from that?
No.
You had mentioned 2 members are interested in advocacy here. Is there someone else from the organization that's on the SAC?
Not from that organization. There are 2 members, one from the State Council of Churches, which is very engaged in advocacy around this, and one from an organization called NeighborWorks, which is mostly focused on housing, but also is working on this issue as a
Is either of those
predatory
positions
for the
a paid
low-income.
position?
Commissioner Harrod, I'm going to ask you again to let Chair Steinfeld speak before you speak so that we can have a clear transcript.
Yes, those are their professional positions, I believe both.
Okay. And which members are those?
That's Member Morisseau and Member Anderson.
From which organizations? Which one goes with which?
Member Anderson from the State Council of Churches and Member Morisseau from NeighborWorks Blackstone Valley.
I guess I would continue on this point that, like, you may be making this worse. You're talking about people who are desperate for credit. And you can dry up that credit, or you can make the amount larger. Drying up that credit may drive them to other acts of desperation.
That's certainly possible, but we don't think that it should be allowable to create something that is so predatory on people when there are alternative sources available.
Chair Steinfeld, I wanted to follow up on that question. This is Chair Lehman. The report notes that you have a set of recommendations for what Rhode Island should do to investigate the underlying financial circumstances that leave Rhode Islanders, in particular Rhode Islanders of color, especially in need of the credit advances that payday loans provide. And you also mentioned that your State Advisory Committee plans next week to discuss possible next steps following from this report. I wonder if one possibility for your advisory committee might be to investigate those underlying reasons and to address the civil rights issues that follow from that level of financial insecurity for Rhode Islanders.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly something that we're interested in looking at and just seeing if there are other areas where our commission can investigate potential civil rights violation that lead to what we see as a significant income disparity based on race.
I was very taken with the thoroughness of this report, and I also appreciate your noting at the beginning of your presentation that your advisory committee has seized on your reappointment as a moment to deliver results from your expertise. And so thank you for your productivity and also for the detail in this report. I generally am not, and in this instance, am not recommending a particular topic for any state advisory committee to take up. I was very taken with the quantum of information that you took in on this topic and the kinds of civil rights issues that could follow in addition to the specific recommendations about payday loan caps that your report includes.
I have a question, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Yockey, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this report. Did your committee review at all the proposed payday regulations proposed by the CFPB, and did they have any response to the fact that the CFPB has now indicated it's going to reconsider those rules that were enacted in last year, the Obama administration?
We did have somebody present from the CFPB, and we do have some information. We have not considered in light of that reconsideration. However, I will say that that reconsideration is largely due to the question that was brought up by a member around access to credit, and knowing that in our state there are alternative credit sources really makes that be a specific recommendation for our state, whereas if there was not alternative access to capital, we might have a different finding.
Got it. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner
Madam
Dagway?
Chair, this is Vice Chair Timmons Goodson. I have a brief question.
Go ahead, Vice Chair.
Yes. I see in the report where you discuss the adverse effect that payday loans have on the state's economy. I thought that was interesting because rarely do we think about the effect on the state's economy. We usually focus on the individual. Would you mind saying a word or two more about the adverse effect on Rhode Island's economy?
Sure. Essentially, we have a significant enough portion of our population, especially our low-income population, spending their income generating, sales or et cetera. They're spending their income paying back payday lenders, and the payday lenders are not located in Rhode Island, so that's not money that stays locally. You can make an argument that there are, some employees, et cetera, who work locally, but that tends to be very a small proportion of the money that's actually staying as part of our local economy. So it's essentially taking money from our lower income folks, many of whom are receiving state subsidies as well, and it's extracting that out of our state economy and moving that to national corporations, and therefore not generating wealth. In addition to harder, more intangible costs of stress, anxiety, et cetera, for people who get stuck in this debt trap.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Commissioner Dagway?
Yes, thank you very much for this report. I was just wondering if the industry has explained or offered any explanation about why the phenomenon that you describe on page 12 exists. On page 12 of the report, you write, when comparing neighborhoods with the same median income, neighborhoods with significant Black and Latino populations had a 70% higher concentration of payday loan stores than white neighborhoods at the same income level. Have we heard from the industry about what the rationale of that economic model is?
We did not even get the courtesy of a return phone call, turning down an opportunity to present at our briefing. So no, we have not heard any response from the industry.
Has anybody elsewhere offered a rationale about why that pattern would exist?
The only rationale that we have seen is from people with a particular advocacy position, but the argument is that based in historical inequality in terms of access to credit and suspicion or doubt about the ability of banks to serve people, as well as the history of redlining and lack of access to actual lending institutions in low-income communities.
Thanks. One other question on the points that Commissioner Harriet raised. Do financial institutions have an independent duty when they're lending to figure out whether or not somebody whom they're lending to has the ability to repay a loan?
Traditional lenders do have that requirement. Payday lenders do not.
And so would it necessarily be the rational choice of a lender who determines that they can't lend at a low amount of money to lend more money, a higher sum of money in the way that Commissioner Harriet posits?
Again, for a traditional banking institution, certainly not. For a payday lender, they essentially are doing an unsecured loan. And so they would have, it would depend on whether the business model made sense for them, I guess, that whether they have a higher default rate then makes it worthwhile.
Thanks very much.
Having no further questions, Ms. Steinfeld, thank you so much for your service and your leadership on the Rhode Island State Advisory Committee and for taking the time to speak with us today. We very much appreciate your presentation.
Thank you so much.
And we'll move to our next item on the agenda, which is to hear from our Vermont Advisory Committee Chair, Curtis Reed Jr., on the committee's recently released advisory memorandum titled Housing Discrimination in Vermont, A Handshake and a Smile. Chair Curtis, we will enjoy hearing from you for 10 minutes.
Good morning from yet another sub-freezing day in Vermont. My speech may falter here or there as I'm still recovering from lingering respiratory issues due to a bout of bronchitis. So this will be a slow presentation. On behalf of all the members of the Vermont State Advisory Committee, I thank the Commission for the opportunity to brief the Commissioners on housing discrimination in Vermont. In addition, we wish to thank the staff of the Commission's Eastern Regional Office, particularly Barbara Delavies, for her decades-long support and counsel to the Vermont SAC. Vermont, by most any definition, is a small place, whether measured by land mass, population, or productivity. Our population of less than 624,000 residents, 10.3% of us are disabled, 5.5% of us are ethnic or racial minorities, and 4.5% of us are foreign-born, according to the latest census data. We live on a human scale, where there is seemingly a 1-degree separation between any two residents. Our tendency is not to fight with our neighbor, because we will need them to push our car out of the snowbank during the winter or muddy road during mud season. And while our numbers are small, the impact of civil rights abuses on those of us in protected categories looms forever large. Our memorandum, titled Housing Discrimination in Vermont, A Handshake and a Smile, reflects, on the one hand, a culture where everyone needs to get along. However, on the other hand, landlords and property owners who do not fully understand their legal obligations perpetuate housing discrimination, particularly for those of us with disabilities, ethnic or racial minorities, or foreign-born. Since our briefing, Vermont, as part of its obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, last prepared its required analysis of impediments in 2017. This 2017 update to the 200-page 2012 report found that 46 Vermont fair housing complaints were filed with federal and state agencies between January 2013 and July 2016. Over half of these complaints involve discrimination on the basis of disability, while the rest involve discrimination on the basis of familial status or presence of minor children, race, color, and sex. In addition, 189 people called legal aid and made a housing discrimination complaint with Vermont Legal Aid between March 2015 and November 2016. The majority of these complaints, 68%, were related to disability discrimination. The remaining complaints involved discrimination based on other protected categories. The analysis of impediments report found that discrimination based on disability, familial status, and other protected categories continues to occur in Vermont. The report also found that the supply of affordable housing, especially affordable and accessible housing in Vermont, is inadequate. Based on the information gathered by this review, the committee believes that housing discrimination likely persists in Vermont, in part because many landlords do not fully understand their legal obligations. It is also clear that the lack of affordable housing in the state makes it even harder for individuals of color and individuals with disabilities in Vermont, who are often also low income, to find housing. At the same time, the committee's inquiry into housing discrimination has been impeded by its inability to independently investigate complaints. For that reason, it is difficult for the committee to complete a meaningful assessment of whether and the extent to which Vermont residents seeking housing are discriminated against based on the basis of race, disability, color, national origin, sex, religion, familial status, age, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and the receipt of public assistance. Based on available literature and testimony at the briefing, the committee acknowledges persistence of housing discrimination in the state and its effect on Vermont residents of color and individuals with disabilities. The committee notes that additional training and education for landlords and other housing professionals regarding their legal obligations under the Fair Housing Act and the Vermont Fair Housing Act has the potential to reduce housing discrimination in Vermont. It may also be beneficial to expand the efforts to inform tenants of their rights under the laws. In other states, this has been accomplished through the use of flyers and bus advertisements that educate readers on types of prohibited discrimination. The committee also identified a need for a housing discrimination hotline that would allow landlords and tenants to access information on what practices are discriminatory. I thank you for suffering through my halting voice, but I'm open to taking questions. Thank you.
Chair Reed, thank you very much for your presentation, and also thank you for sticking with us notwithstanding illness. We very much appreciate it. I'll open for questions from my fellow commissioners. While people are formulating thoughts, I'll jump in with a few questions of my own. Chair Reed, I noticed at the penultimate page of your report, a reference to the analysis of impediments submitted in 2017 from the state, and your description of that notes that there were 46 fair housing compliant state in a 3-year period that preceded that, and separately that there were 189 people who had called the legal aid office in Vermont in, let's say, 6-month period from March 2015 to November 2016. I wonder if you and your fellow committee members were able to form views about what accounts for the difference in contacts between a nonprofit and government agencies with respect to fair housing, and if you could share thoughts about what may account for the difference in points of contact on what your committee describes as a persistent concern in the state.
No, there is no particular conversation or discussion about the difference in the two. One might conjecture that given that Vermont legal aid has sort of a much broader contact with community, they would be the natural point for community members to go to as a known entity.
And so that would underscore your point about the value of notice to tenants about their rights as one of the recommendations that you have on the last page of the report. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you. Also, as you may know, the Commission is in the middle of an ongoing investigation about the effectiveness of federal civil rights enforcement across issue areas and agencies. And so obviously one of the issues that we're investigating is fair housing and fair housing enforcement. And I note very strong parallels between the information in your committee's report and information that we took in from the HUD representative at our briefing about the challenge in addressing the volume of fair housing need in this country with limited ability to investigate complaints and identify the scope of need. And I wonder if you have thoughts about what it would take to be able to evaluate what actual circumstances are on the ground in addition to the points of contact that people make with federal agencies, state agencies, and or nonprofits.
There's, in terms of improving service, it's really a function of, to what extent is one able to be involved in the community, with the community. I think federal agencies have more constraints, or may perceive they have more constraints to get out, to visit, and engage community groups in conversations about what the needs are in their particular communities, not only around housing, but in terms of law enforcement, in terms of education, that local groups, have a much greater capacity, I think, for going to where community members are and listening with a critical ear that allows community members to say, let's go to the state, to the nonprofit or state agency as opposed to a federal agency.
Thank you. I have just one more question, and that is that at page 4 of your report, you note that the Champlin area NAACP received 50 complaints regarding the availability of housing in the 11 months that preceded your briefing, which was in 2015. And I wonder if you have views about the reliability of the state's analysis of impediments submitted in 2017, not referring to those kinds of complaints, those specifically to that NAACP or more generally to complaints to other nonprofits related to fair housing issues. Is that an oversight that is surprising to you, or is that something that you would not consider an oversight at all?
No, it's not surprising, but also keep in mind that when people go to the NAACP, they're typically going with not just one particular complaint, but also sort of multiple complaints, out of which NAACP is teasing out the data specific to housing. But that there are, issues around discrimination in the workplace or the inability to get a job, education, and so the places like the NAACP, whether it's in Champlain Valley or Rutland or in southeastern Vermont, community members come in with a litany of issues, and it's difficult but not necessarily impossible for a federal agency just to narrow in on the housing issue in and of itself. Because I think there's a tendency not to want to hear what the other sort of complaint areas are, that they just want you to focus on housing or education or workplace discrimination. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the way community members' minds work is a much more holistic fashion in terms of the interconnectedness of these various forms of discrimination and harassment.
Thank you very much, Chair Curtis. Other questions from other commissioners? Hearing none, I will thank you very much, and we can move on to our next item. But first, thank you for your service and for your leadership on the Vermont State Advisory Committee and for the advisory memorandum that you shared with us today. And thank you again for presenting Notwithstanding Illness. We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Madam
as well.
Chair.
Yes.
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Narasaki. I just wanted to let you know that I had joined before the Vermont SAC Chair began his report.
Welcome. We're delighted to have you. So our next item is a discussion and vote on the discovery materials, namely the discovery plan, outline, and timeline for the Commission's project on women in prison. To begin discussion, is there a motion?
I move we adopt the plan.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Madam Chair, I second.
Terrific. Thank you. Commissioner Cladney, as the sponsor of this project, would you begin our discussion?
My office has been working closely with OCRE, and we have developed this plan, and I feel it's very comprehensive. It's an issue-oriented briefing. The panels will be issue-oriented rather than group-oriented. I think it's a pretty well-rounded discovery plan, and recently they have come up with a list of witnesses that I think are all-encompassing on the issue, and I urge adoption.
Terrific. Thank you. To continue our discussion, I'll offer a few points. First, I am very grateful for the Office of Civil Rights Evaluation, the specific expertise that we get to benefit from for this project. And I also appreciate Commissioner Cladney leading this and the research that has come from your office as well to move us forward. I believe that you all together will lead us through this investigation with a solid foundation, and I look forward to taking up this issue in more depth with a briefing in February 2019. Is there any other discussion? Commissioner Harriet?
I just want to say the side of this that interests me the most is the education side. I've spoken to Commissioner Cladney on this, and I just want to make sure that we're going to be looking into what gets taught at various prisons. I mean, it seems to me that the reason this is an interesting issue is that there are a lot more men in prison than there are women, and that therefore there are economies of scale at men's prisons that you don't get in women's prisons. And I would like to see as much data as we can get on that issue, And I'm wondering if Commissioner Cladney can talk about that for a second.
Excuse me. Thank you, Commissioner Harriet.
You might-
Thank you, Commissioner Harriet, for your interest. We have several witnesses who will speak to rehabilitation in those terms. You've accurately pointed to an issue that is a very lively issue in regards to women in prison. They do not have my preliminary research, not to draw any conclusions early. My preliminary research has shown that, in fact, men do have more outlets in terms of rehabilitation and learning skills in prison. While we were talking earlier, you had mentioned, I think, welding, and that has come up. Electrics has come up, electrician training, plumbing, real construction type jobs. And my office's preliminary research has shown they are, and we plan to have witnesses. There will be witnesses at the briefing who can address that specifically. We will have one lady, Alex McLaren, who is BOP's in charge of the women's facilities.
The whole facilities or just the education?
All facilities.
I will just interrupt to note that we don't know who will actually speak at the briefing itself. We know who we might invite.
Right.
And we haven't voted on that yet.
Let me put it this way. I believe she will be invited, and I firmly believe that she will probably attend. And although I'm speculating, a woman of her stature would be able to address all those issues.
What I would like to see, if we can get this, is like, have an appendix to the report that says, here are the courses that are offered at such and such a prison. Here are the ones that are offered at another. So we really, instead of just getting them off the cuff when we're asking them a question like what gets taught, when, you won't get completely accurate information there. I would like it if we could ask that witness to give us just the straight data on, in the year 2018, which by then will be finished, what got taught at, maybe not every federal prison, but if we had a good sample of men's versus women's prisons.
I will try to obtain that. I think because BOP, I don't know how many women's facilities they have, but it's not many throughout the country.
That's the basic problem.
And
I think it speaks well for women, by the way.
Thank you very much. Yes, it does.
Though I could say nice things about men too. The one I can't say is that they are less likely to commit a crime that will cause them to go to prison.
I am speechless. Anyways.
So keeping us moving productively, I think it might be time for us to call a question and take a roll call vote. So Commissioner Degbele, how do you?
Madam Chair.
I'm sorry. Madam Vice Chair, go ahead.
Madam Chair. Yes, I just wanted to add, thank Commissioner Cladney for his leadership on this. What appeals to me is the fact that this report will come on the heels of our collateral consequences one. And so to some degree, it allows us to do a slightly deeper dive as we look at women in prison and collateral consequences. And so I like that, and good job thus far.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll turn to calling the question and taking a roll call vote. Commissioner Degbele, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
I'll vote aye on the ground that Commissioner Cladney's going to try to get that information that I just mentioned.
Right, thank
But
you.
did I just vote aye on the timeline as well? Is that part of the deal here?
Yes.
Or are we voting separately on that?
I think Commissioner Cladney's motion was to approve all of the project materials. Is that
Yes,
correct?
it was.
Okay, I may have something to say about the timeline.
Do you want to pause for discussion?
Yeah, I'm just a little bit concerned about, section 4 here, which is kind of oddly numbered since the dates on section 4 come after the dates on section 3. And it looks like we would be getting affected agency review incorporated the very same day that we are voting, which doesn't make sense to me. It may be that there will be no such changes But if there are significant changes, I don't see how we can be voting on the project on the same day.
I think the vote is actually, we disseminate the project for vote on that day, but the vote itself takes place on November 8th. So it gets disseminated on October 25th. And that's the day that the affected agency review.
Is there some way to move that affected agency review up? I mean, that strikes me as very late in the game.
I'm sorry, also just to be clear, that the affected agency review comes in on October 18th, and it's the responses to it are incorporated on October 25th. And then as those responses are incorporated, they are submitted to the commissioners for vote, and the vote follows on November 8th. So we would receive the affected agency review October 18th, and then vote on November 8th.
Okay, well, that's good enough for me.
Okay.
I am concerned, though, that an affected agency review can be a big deal.
Yes, agreed.
And it can be, it can really, really change the report. And if this one does, I think we're going to have to put off the vote. But if it doesn't, then we're okay.
Right. So that's a bridge we could cross then, but I appreciate the concern.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So turning back to a vote, as we had proceeded, let me just confirm
that I'm still a yes.
You're still a yes. And Commissioner Degbolay, did that discussion change your vote?
No.
Commissioner Kursnow?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Cladney?
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Yaki?
I'd like a vote on whether I can really understand anything that went on in the previous discussion on the previous vote, but I'll vote yes anyway.
I appreciate your informed vote, Commissioner Yaki. Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote yes, so the motion passes unanimously. The next item is a discussion and vote on the briefing date for the Commission project on sexual harassment in federal workplaces. To begin discussion, is there a motion?
I'd like to move that we revisit the date of that report.
Is there a second?
I'll second
that.
Gladney.
Do we have a proposal?
Yes, I'll speak to it with greater specificity. The motion is that we move the date from the presently scheduled May 17th to May 9th.
Okay, so is there a second to that?
Gladney, I'll second.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion?
Yes, I would just, before we vote, like to anticipatorily thank the commissioners and staff for considering this modification.
Any further discussion?
This is Commissioner Narasaki. I understand that it falls around Commissioner Yaki's anniversary, and Commissioner Adegbile might want to send a card or something to his wife.
Flowers, candy. Yes.
I'm happy to take on the responsibility for all of the above, and I also
I just
yield
want
the
to
floor
note
to
that
Commissioner Yaki.
I think for the past 10 years, I've endeavored to schedule this so it does not fall on that, and every single time it gets changed. And the enduring patience of my wife is something to behold on this particular matter, since sometimes it fell on like key anniversary dates. So
The commission is the gift that just keeps on giving.
and special thanks go to Commissioner Yaki, and I will pay penance to your wife.
Thank you.
So unless there's any further discussion, I'll call the question. We can take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degbolay, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
Yes.
Commissioner Kursnow?
Yes.
Commissioner Cladney?
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki?
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki?
Aye, with extreme reservations.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote
And I'll
yes.
report the extreme reservations to Commissioner Yaki's wife.
So the motion passes unanimously again. So now we'll take up our amended agenda items, beginning with the extension of the stand your ground statement deadlines. To begin your discussion, is there a motion?
Yes, this is Commissioner Yaki. I'd like to amend the deadline so that the statements are due on January 11th, 2019. Rebuttals due on February 11th, and rebuttal notice due on February 18th, text on February 25th. This has been worked and given the okay by Commissioners Harriet and Kursenau and other members of the commission. So I ask for this to be approved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Narasaki seconds.
I think Commissioner Kursenau beat you to the second. We'll take it. Thank you. Unless there's further discussion, I'll call the question and take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degbele, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
Yes.
Commissioner Kursenau?
Yes.
Commissioner Cladney?
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki?
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki?
Aye.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote yes. The motion passes unanimously. Now we'll turn to our second amended agenda item, which is a discussion and vote on a letter to HHS regarding reported plans to define gender. To begin discussion, is there a motion?
Yes, sorry, this is Commissioner Narasaki. I move that we adopt the letter to HHS concerning the definition of gender, and we'll be happy to read it at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. To begin discussion, I'll start with Commissioner Narasaki. Commissioner Narasaki, we would benefit from your reading it so we know what it is we're voting on.
Yes, and staying with our tradition, I am not going to read the footnotes so that we won't be here for days. It reads, Dear Secretary Azar, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights writes to urge the Department of Health and Human Services not to narrowly define gender to a biological, immutable condition determined at birth. We are concerned that such a definition will have serious negative impacts on the health, welfare, and civil rights of members of the transgender community. Defining federal protections barring discrimination of the basis of sex to exclude protections for transgender people runs counter to longstanding legal precedent and will leave transgender people vulnerable to unlawful discrimination. Approximately 1.4 million Americans identify themselves as transgender and are widely recognized by the medical community as facing barriers to accessing high-quality medical care. The transgender community is a uniquely vulnerable community, and many of the Commission's recent investigations highlight the discrimination and significant health, social, and economic barriers they face. For instance, in our report on workplace discrimination against the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT community, we found that LGBT workers have faced a long, serious, and pervasive history of official and unofficial employment discrimination by both federal, state, and local governments and private employers. Our research indicated workplace discrimination can drastically increase psychological stress and other mental health problems. Many transgender workers report experience hostile work environments where they are often mistreated, harassed, physically or sexually assaulted, forced to present as a gender they do not identify with, asked inappropriate questions, and deliberately taunted by the use of incorrect pronouns by their coworkers. Our report also found many transgender individuals consider themselves underemployed because they are overqualified for the position. Transgender people often report such jobs because of difficulties of being hired. According to a 2011 report, transgender respondents who were unemployed have nearly double the rate of engaging in survival sex work, 4 times the rate of homelessness, and 85% duration compared to those who were employed. In addition, they are disproportionately likely to be HIV positive, use drugs or drink heavily, and have multiple suicide attempts. Our most recent report is related to the trauma members of the transgender community experience because of disparate treatment and harassment from law enforcement. Members of the transgender community reported frequent harassment by law enforcement. The report found that 59% of transgender respondents reported being stopped by police and being profiled as sex workers when they were conducting routine daily tasks in the neighborhood. Of these individuals stopped, 51% of all LGBT respondents and 61% of
transgender respondents reported that they had been physically or verbally harassed, and some also reported sexual abuse by police officers, including being forced to perform sexual acts under threat of arrest. A 2013 research study by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs found that 48% of LGBT, sorry, I'm trying to read this on my laptop. Hate crime survivors reported that they experienced police misconduct. They found that transgender women were 4 times more likely to experience police violence compared to all overall survivors. Transgender people overall were 7 times more likely to experience physical violence when interacting with the police compared to cisgender survivors and victims. As the Commission's research makes clear, it is critical that this community has the same level of access to health care and health services that all Americans have. By adopting such a narrow definition of gender, the department will effectively be erasing the identities of transgender people and endangering their access to health care that meets their unique needs. Such a definition sends a message that the transgender community should not exist, fosters and encourages prejudice and values, and will have additional serious implications if adopted across agencies. Such a narrow definition would also be contrary to many federal courts that have ruled on this very issue in interpreting federal civil rights laws and whose opinions are binding in their jurisdictions. Transgender boys' exclusion from a boys' locker room, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit pointed out that Title IX does not use the term biological for sex, and went on to hold that the policy individual to use a bathroom that does not conform with his or her gender identity punishes that individual for his or her gender nonconformance, which in turn violates Title IX. Similarly, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit rejected an employer's argument that Title VII's bar on sex discrimination was limited to biological sex and held that discrimination on the basis of transgender and transitioning violates Title VII. The Commission calls on the Department of Health and Human Services to reject any plans that may have to narrowly define gender and to work to ensure civil rights of members of the transgender community are protected. We request the opportunity to meet with you or your staff at your earliest convenience to discuss this urgent issue. We look forward to a response sincerely.
Thank you, Commissioner Arasaki. I noted as you were reading one friendly amendment I'd like to offer, which is in paragraph 1, in the third sentence, it begins defining federal protections barring discrimination of. We could change that of to on. I think it would just be more grammatically correct.
I'm happy to accept the friendly amendment.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Commissioner Hyatt?
One concern I have is that this is very premature. There is not yet a policy out there. But another clarification here is that, your footnote 1 refers to a New York Times article that claims that such a policy, is forthcoming. And in that second line there, you say that the Department of Health and Human Services is going to define gender. Well, gender is not a statutory term in most of these statutes. The term that, if the article is correct, it quotes from a memo that talks about defining sex, not defining gender. And sex is indeed a statutory term. And hence it wouldn't be terribly surprising if there's a memo out there that does indeed attempt to define sex within the meaning of those statutes. But the notion that they're defining given that sex is actually the term statute, and hence sex is that presumably needs defining. It's a fundamental error in the letter as it's presented right now. Also, I think that from the standpoint of the progressive agenda, you're shooting yourself in the foot. If it's, you know, if you're going to define sex, in a way that's more in keeping